All right, now the last one that we're going to talk about, we're still in section 6.4, is a square. All right, now a square, just like a rhombus and a rectangle, is a parallelogram. So same thing I drew up before, is a square has all of the characteristics, meaning the opposite sides are parallel, the opposite sides are congruent, the opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, and that the diagonals bisect each other. All right, so it has all of these traits plus a little bit more. A square, what makes this so special is that a square's definition is that it has 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides, meaning the 4 right angles makes it a rectangle, and the 4 congruent sides makes it a rhombus. So a square has the properties of a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus. So a square has the properties of every single thing that we just talked about in section 4. So it has all 3. All right, so a square, opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary. The diagonals not only bisect each other because of a parallelogram, but the diagonals are also congruent. So that means AC is going to be congruent to BD, right? Because a rectangle's diagonals are congruent. And it also means that the angles will bisect each other. So it means all of these angles will be congruent. So a square has every single characteristic that we've talked about parallelogram, rectangle, or a rhombus. Right? So just to give you a little Venn diagram of what this would look like. So if we have so the overall, everything in here is a parallelogram. And then some of the parallelograms will be a rhombus. Some of them will be a rectangle. And where the rectangles and rhombus share, where they're both 90-degree angles and they're both congruent sides, that is where it's a square. All right, so that means every single square is a rectangle. Every single square is a rhombus. Every single rectangle is a parallelogram, and every single rhombus is a parallelogram. All right, so that means every square is always a rectangle, and it's always a rhombus, and it's always a parallelogram. All right, but a square has all 3. All right, now the question that we're going to do here is more so of next section, where you're determining if it's a rectangle, rhombus, square, parallelogram, but we're going to solve it now in this section as well. All right, so it's saying, is this parallelogram a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square? Well, since it tells us that the sides are congruent here, so it tells us it's a parallelogram, that means I can guarantee that this opposite side is congruent and that opposite side is congruent as well because it's a parallelogram. So I know the opposite sides are congruent. So now I know all 4 sides are congruent. So right now, I know it's at least a rhombus. Now they tell me that this angle is 90 degrees. So I know the opposite angle also has to be 90 degrees since it is a parallelogram. And I know the consecutive angles are supplementary, meaning that this plus this angle have to add up to 180. And since this is 90, this one has to be 90. And then the opposite angles are congruent. So that means all 4 angles are right angles. So it is a rectangle as well. And when it's both a rectangle and a rhombus, that means it is a square. So this figure is a square. All right, now you guys are going to hand this problem in. So it's section 6.4.3, and you will put this in your notes, take a picture, solve for this, and we'll go from there. All right, so you'll take the picture, put it in your notes. Try not to do this by typing it out because it could be a little bit messy and harder for me to follow. All right, so I'd prefer if you could take a picture and then put that into your notes that you guys are creating that you shared with me. All right, and that's it for section 4. We'll move on to section 5, which is kind of like this question we did here, which is we're going to be able to identify if figures are squares, rhombuses, or rectangles.